to those who may be viewing this recording. And I am Ralph Johnson. I'm the immediate past president of the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education, better known as CAS. And I have the pleasure of introducing and just talking for a few minutes with a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Susan Komives. How are you doing, Susan?
I'm doing great. Good to see you, Ralph.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the fact that Susan and I are connected in so many ways through Florida State, through
Yes.
professional associations to include CAS. But we also have something else in common. She has another Ralph in her life, and that is her husband, Ralph. And then I just happen to be her good friend, Ralph.
You may be the only two I know.
Is that right? Well, how coincidental is that? So as we begin our conversation about CAS and its history and what it's been doing over the last 45 years, I just want to begin with a question, Susan, and just ask, how did you become connected to CAS?
Well, it's wonderful to go down memory lane on that one. I knew about CAS from the very beginning. I was on the executive committee of ACPA when Ted Miller, along with Don, were looking at CACREP. APGA, one of the groups, had started an accrediting body for counseling and related professional services. Don Creamer talks about that in the origin story for CAS. But I remember all of us being concerned that CACREP wasn't right for us, and we did need to do some other approach to quality assurance work, which was the label at the time in particular. So Ted and Don and Phyllis worked to form CAS. I remember going to a meeting Phyllis had in DC. I was visiting at the time with Lynn Battle, who was with the career development people, and talking to them about being in the foundational group to form CAS. So that was one of my primary early experiences. Then in 1986, the first book came out, and
Okay.
the first standard was the master's program standard. And I joined the Maryland graduate faculty in 1987.
Oh,
So we
okay.
were able to right away start using and appreciated having this first standard. Of course, Bud Thomas was really important at Maryland. He was the vice chancellor for student affairs, but he also was the NASPA rep that helped found CAS and served as its treasurer until he retired. So the Maryland legacy of contributing to CAS was really strong in the Kool-Aid there, and I was real happy to be part of all that process. I believed in what CAS was doing.
Yes, I vividly remember when I came onto the CAS Council myself in 2006, that we had quite a few representatives from Maryland, and Maryland was a significant part of that foundation. So we appreciate the University of Maryland for allowing its employees, particularly within the sphere of student affairs, to be so involved with a very important organization.
Of
Uh,
course, that was also because associations had to pay, and still do, for their own reps to attend the meetings. So a lot of associations would appoint someone local from one of the local universities, and Maryland then had a number of members of these associations who were representing those groups.
it's funny you say that as well, because that's precisely how I got appointed to represent SACSA. They knew that my predecessor was leaving, and they said, "Well, who's around Maryland? Ralph, would you be willing?" I'm like, "Sure, why not?"
Sure.
And I just joined, and I've not missed a beat since. I thoroughly enjoyed and continue to enjoy my work with CAS. Why is CAS important in higher education overall?
Well, I think for several reasons. One of them being for our own work, largely through student affairs, for the assurance of having standards and guidelines that would guide the quality work we want to do with students, but also the self-assessment of that work. And higher ed's emphasis on learning and developmental outcomes, along with data, evidence that shows through assessment what the impact of those outcomes are through the programs and services we have. So CAS both helps people establish the programs of quality that should then lead to those kinds of good outcomes. And so I think it's important to do that. I don't think it's implemented always with the consistency, breadth, quality, depth that we would all hope, but it is a starting place for many higher ed institutions that need to seriously look at the experiences of their student affairs programs.
Absolutely. How did you use it in your own work while you were still involved?
Yeah, well, I did because, as I said, I was in student affairs practice largely when CAS was formed. One of the ways was in 1985. I went to the University of Tampa as vice president, and we really needed some help with our commuter program. We wanted to start one, so there were commuter program standards then that we used to establish what programs and services those students would need. And of course, as I said, we used them in our grad program at Maryland on the grad faculty to modify our program. But the most fun thing I can think of is in 1981, the National Clearinghouse for Leadership Programs, which we had started at Maryland, held an invitational symposium to try to reposition what colleges were doing around student leadership development.
Okay.
And one of the subcommittees that I was on and chaired said we need to have a CAS standard on student leadership programs.
Right.
So we,
Okay.
in all of our naivety, blissfully went out and looked at the CAS standard format and developed a standard, and then got a hold of CAS and said, here it is. Would you all want to endorse this standard? And they said, well, wait a minute. We're the ones that usually develop the standards, and we need to make sure that it fits our format. And said, but also up to then, CAS standards were only functional areas. They weren't conceptual areas. Like leadership development happens all across the institution, not just
Right.
in an office. So they said, we have to really decide if we want to go in that direction or not. So they spent some time discussing the direction CAS would take, and then took on that leadership standard, reviewed it, made it its own, and it got approved as one of the standards. So we developed a standard without even knowing what we were doing.
Right. Well, it turned out wonderfully. And I,
Yes.
I remember it hasn't been too long ago that we updated the standards on leadership programs.
Yes.
It is comprehensive. So
Yes.
that foundation was certainly there, that gave us what is now a much more robust set of standards around leadership programs. Absolutely.
Good.
So what other standards were developed and passed while you were serving on the council?
Well, boy, I remember us being busy. We also, at that point, I think there was a tipping point where we got aware of how busy we were. There were
Yes,
almost too many to manage because
right.
we were revising 4 or 5 each year on a regular 10-year basis, and then developing new ones. When I was then president, we developed ones on campus security, on
Right.
parent and family programs, on sexual assault and relationship violence, on veterans programs, on
Mhm.
graduate and professional student standards, student standards. And then I chaired one on education programs abroad. So study abroad kinds of programs.
Right, right.
And I think of at least 6 that we developed that were brand new, as well as the 4 or 5 we reviewed each year to update them.
Well, Susan, you kept us busy, didn't you?
Well, and we were also adding new associations at that time too. And it was really fun to work in that regard because more and more associations wanted to be part of the CAS process. I remember getting a number of emails from people in Texas
Oh,
because
really?
the State Higher Ed Commission in Texas had required all administrative units, if there were standards of practice in their field, to use them and to show them how they were using them. So I was getting all these calls from people in Texas, like legal services, saying, do you have standards on student legal services? Well, we didn't, but that was a lot of fun. But we did add 4 new associations in those 3 years I was in the presidency. We added the International College Law Enforcement Administrators, IACLEA,
Yes, I remember that.
the group that now is called Family Engagement in Higher Education. It was parent and family programs then. And College Media Association, that came out of one of these Texas inquiries. And then the National Institute for the Study of Transfer Students was added. So we were developing those relationships and developing materials to support new associations so they'd know what we were, how to explain CAS to their members, what the benefits were to them in being members. So that was a busy time for us.
It really was. Now that you bring all that back to me, I remember how exhausted we were when we would leave the council meetings. It was, and in those days, it was called the board. It was the CAS board. And as
Yes,
you
the
know, we
board.
have since revamped things, and we now have the governing board, and then we have the CAS council itself. So Many, many changes have happened since your presidency. But I'm just curious, what other interesting things may have happened during your presidency that you'd like to highlight, if any?
Well, we really did a lot, organizations evolve and grow and change, and CAS was really aware of needing to do some strategic planning,
Right.
so we did a lot of that. But we did a number of things that were to improve our internal work with ourselves. We had already established a statement on ethics, on individual excellence. We had identified and were using 16 learning outcomes that CAS standards needed to address, but we continue to revise those with the work from a document called Learning Reconsidered.
Exactly.
ACPA and NASPA had done.
Mhm.
So we kept making the learning outcomes fit better into how offices and programs used them. We also started a research grant process so we could fund studies of how CAS was being used. And one of the biggest internal things was this whole set of stuff we did around technology. I mean, technology certainly was very big in the 90s and into the early 2000s. And in the time then when I was president, we had to streamline our standards review. We designed, Matt Weissmantel, who is the staff member and the board member in charge of our standards review process, designed a whole web system for us to review the standards online. And the standards book came out only every 3 years. Well, 3 years is a long time in higher
Yes.
education. So
Mhm.
I looked on several of our associations' websites, and they had links from their website to a standard for their area, which they're allowed to do. But some of those, or they had documents, some were PDFs that were like 10 years out of date. So we worked on a system to link them to the most recent standard automatically, so that they were always up to date. Once a revision was done, that link went to the place where that current revision lived. And I think that that was more timely, it was more responsive. We also found out that a lot of campuses and some of the survey research firms that were big at the time were putting CAS standards into computer and web-based formats. And we had to figure out, how do we do that in CAS? How can we make that a source of revenue for us, but also be much more responsive to how people are using them? So I invited in and we heard presentations from the assessment survey firms, like it was called Student Voice at the time, and EBI, and we knew we would be going more in that direction. That continued well after me, of course, because those were big projects, but we were getting that started. Although one of the strategic emphasis areas was the external work that I really enjoyed doing for CAS, and that CAS we knew always needed. We did a lot of internal work, but we had to get out there more externally. So we had
Right.
a symposium on putting CAS in practice, had
That's
uh,
right.
400 or so people come to
Yes.
that were using it in various stages, wanted to learn how to use it. We were asked to join ACPA and NASPA on developing the competencies for the profession, because together CAS, ACPA, and NASPA would be finding ways to implement those. And in our case, they informed our revision of our general standards, because we wanted to be in tune with what the field said needed to be happening. And we got invited, and I was real pleased with this, to something called the New Leadership Alliance for Student Learning and Accountability. It was coordinated by the Big Six associations in DC, like the American Council on Education. And for CAS to be there talking about what we had been doing for 25 years, and that people didn't even know we existed in some cases, but there was a lot of awareness raised then among those general higher ed associations about the work that we did. So in the 30th anniversary we were having during one of the years I was in office, we made a point to get, for example, recognize leadership in those associations doing assessment work. ACPA gave CAS the Contribution to Higher Ed Award. The Community College Group, the Student Development Association, awarded CAS an award. And we made sure we were on programs for ASH and AAHE and AAC&U. Very, very important. And then we started getting some different new questions, like, what do we want to do internationally? We were invited by the South African group to come down and do a presentation and expose South African higher education to the standards in the book. And two of our members went down there, all kinds of interesting issues where there ended up not being payment for the books because they were embargoed at
Oh,
import, and so they never got them in time. And it's a really interesting issues. the content of that issue would be, we don't want to say that standards designed for Western, and in this case, American associations, should be adopted wholesale by any other country. They might be a starting base for people to figure out if they wanted to accept or reject or modify things that we are doing. But we would never say that another country's association should do what we think works here.
Okay, great. I mean, I'm just trying to catch my breath because I feel like I've been running down memory lane with you as you're talking about all of these wonderful things that CAS did under your leadership. I remember vividly the symposia that we did. I think they were wonderful. And just a little bit of insight for those who did not realize that we did that. What were the takeaways or the outcomes of those symposia?
Well, I think it was, I think people came with different needs, and pretty much our responses to the assessment we did were very positive. People's needs were met. They could learn how to start using CAS. They could learn from people that had to use the SAGs, the self-assessment guides, and ways they modified them or made them work for themselves. And so I think people really did learn how to go home and have immediately things they could use to implement CAS in their own context. And we found people said the format that we used and the information they got really did that.
Yeah, it was really a great experience. I remember those very well. So you have really done quite a bit within the CAS sphere, and it sounds like you had fun doing it. As you look at where we are now, what's your hope for the future for CAS?
Oh boy. I have several hopes. You know, one of the things I really admired about CAS is all the different 40 associations sitting around the table doing the work of developing standards. And I loved it when they would go around and everybody would talk about things happening within their own association very briefly. And I think there's a huge underdeveloped potential. CAS is the only association I know of where 40 associations several times a year meet to do some common work about the field. Otherwise, it's individual associations, even the ones that cut across lots of fields. That's an underdeveloped interassociational collaboration that's possible, that somehow should be taken advantage of. And I think somebody needs to do something with that.
Excellent. Well, as we wrap up our chat this afternoon, anything else you'd like to share about CAS, your experience with CAS, what has happened, should happen with the organization?
I think we should acknowledge what a remarkable consensus leadership model CAS implements and has now for 45 years.
Right.
Everything that's passed in CAS is done through consensus. And it reminds me to say to people, modify Robert's Rules of Order or get rid of it. CAS would have great discussions around an interesting issue. Then we would say, are we ready for a vote? Would someone make a motion, please? And that motion would be made and everyone's nodding and we could have 100% yes vote because we had worked it through in a way that kept the conversation going, not in a rigid way with Robert's Rules of Order where you can get lost sometimes in the direction of that. But I really admired and think many people could learn from seeing how that consensus model works.
Right. And I really do appreciate the fact that we emphasize the consensus approach, the fact that we work and talk and to some degree compromise until we reach a common decision. And that is something quite remarkable that we can do that
It
with
really is.
40, sometimes more than 40 people around that table, because
Right.
some organizations send 2 people to CAS. So it's really quite phenomenal the kinds of things that we get done during that process. So it's always a pleasure to talk with you. I am so happy that we had an opportunity to work together on the CAS Council, and your significant contributions to the field are just absolutely noteworthy. I remember meeting you for the very first time, as you recall, when I was the president of SACSA, and I had the rare privilege of doing my annual conference in my hometown. And as we were looking for keynoters for the SACSA conference of 1996, someone mentioned your name, and I said, yes. The connection is there with Dr. Hardid, connection is there with Florida State, please. And you were so gracious and you came in and did a phenomenal job. And I'm still thanking you for that. And the opportunity to serve with you again years later on CAS was just, icing on the cake. So again, thank you so much for your contribution.
And thank you for all you've done, Cass.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate that. This has been, an unexpected next step for me. As I said earlier on, I jokingly tell people I was an easy date. They just said, who is near? Do it. And I'm like, sure. And it has turned out to be an almost 18-year commitment. It's been really
good.
So
thank you.
Thank you again. And I appreciate the fact that you received the baton from Jan.
Yes.
And you graciously passed it to Laura.
I did.
And SACSA, CAS, NASPA, ACPA, and all those organizations collectively, thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you.
All right. And good talking with you again. And then we'll be in touch as we continue to talk about the 45th celebration that we will do in November at our council meeting in what has become home, which is, of course, old Alexandria.
Good. Thank you very much.
Take care. All right. Be good. Bye-bye.